Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Josh Wilson, Senior Vice President of Service Lines and Technology at LMI. Josh, good to have you on.
No, thanks, Tom. I appreciate it.
And let's start with this concept of continuous modernization. This is a word that we hear a lot that government agencies are using so they stay out of technical debt and so forth, but also artificial intelligence as a part of that, both to aid the modernization and as a result of it. So, talk about what that all means, how it all comes together, and maybe some of the skill sets required for people that are embarking on this continuous modernization.
Well, thanks, Tom. Yeah, right now today, it's really hard to talk about modernization when you look at the outcomes the government, especially the national security space, is trying to achieve without talking about AI and ML. One of the big aspects, there's a book out there named The Kill Chain by Christian Bozet, who talks a lot about in the future, especially as you look at how assets will be available in space and who are likely enemy or potential enemy forces could be. No one's safe. There is no distance that protects you anymore. So that new reality is kind of one of the things that's on the front of a lot of senior leaders' minds around, okay, if I'm not safe anywhere, how quickly, how fast do we have to execute against these various networks to be safe or to deter and maintain peace? And you can't do that without autonomous vehicles and AI and ML. So that's just a new reality of how you're going to move forward. So basically, all weapon systems going forward are going to have AI, ML enabled capabilities. But that comes with some pretty serious implications as we think through costs, how to sustain them, how to prepare, et cetera. And to your point, that drives a lot of new requirements around the skill sets we'll require from a people standpoint. As I look to today, and you want to talk about skill sets, yes, we need a lot more cloud engineers. Yes, we need a lot more data engineers. But the real challenge we're faced today is we need all our senior leaders, mid and senior, to have a much higher digital IQ, to be able to ask smart questions, to be able to drive resource priorities in an effective way. A lot of our senior leaders are going to have to show up to the job with a much higher level digital IQ than they currently have today.
And when you mentioned the weapon systems and the platforms that will be imbued with this AI, that's also true of the networks that they all operate and interoperate on. Increasingly, you have networked platforms. So I would think the AI has to be built into network operations and control operations, as well as to the platforms themselves in the DoD setting.
Yeah, I mean, well, what you'll see on the network side, I'll just make it plain and simple. If all these things are going to interact with each other, the F-35 with the future Bradley fighting vehicle on the ground, if all these things are going to talk and communicate, then the networks have to be interoperable, first of all. These systems actually have to be able to communicate. The networks have to be set up in a way that we can operate at the speeds we want to operate at. That's a huge challenge in and of itself. But then also just getting the data to a point to where it's actually meaningful. A lot of people jump to that future scenario that you're kind of alluding to, Tom. But a lot of the realities we're confronted with in this space today with a lot of our customers starts with just having good, clean data that's interoperable across systems. You kind of have to have that before you can even start talking about networks in some cases.
Sure. And we should pull on that data question for a second longer. When you say good, clean data in order to train algorithms, that's what you mean?
Yeah, these algorithms, I give this example all the time. You have to generate good quality data to train these machine learning and AI algorithms, right? An example I love giving people that aren't familiar with this space is, when I take my 3 and 4-year-old out into the woods and we go for walks early on in their age, it's every 5 seconds. I'm like, you can't put that in your mouth, right? Don't touch that. Don't eat that. And then by the time they're 6 and 7, they stop putting a lot of that stuff in their mouth they shouldn't put in their mouth, right? But that took years of data points, right? Where you're pointing out to them good versus bad, okay versus not. And that's the same thing with these machine learning and AI algorithms. It's only as good as the data that we train them against. And that data sometimes can be super expensive to create. So as I was alluding to, if you see this future state where all these ML and AI enabled platforms exist, then are we really considering today the cost associated with that? Another example I give is Elon Musk, right? When he and his team, Tesla team, decided to have an AI-enabled platform to do one thing: drive from A to B safely at a very high effectiveness rate of 99.99% safety. You're going to do it right every time. Well, he put hundreds of drivers on trillions of dollars of US infrastructure to create the data necessary to create that effectiveness rate. And that was for one scenario. The DoD has evolving scenarios that change over time, threats that have changed over time. And every time, in the past, we had to think about the man, train, and equip costs associated with these future scenarios, right? But in the future, we're going to be talking about the man, train, equip, and train these digital assets to prepare them for these future scenarios. And that's going to generate a huge bill that I'm not so sure we have the mental models and constructs to really think through today as we're making these acquisition decisions. But it's certainly something that the government's thinking about, certainly something that we're trying to help them think about, amongst others.
And in these specialized settings, like a DoD system, those systems do produce data. Do you find that agencies now are understanding they need to maybe keep it and record it and use it in some way for training, or is this something they yet have to establish the existence of in the first place, the data?
Yeah, I mean, it's not new to anyone, just the sheer amount of data that we generate today. Candidly, we're at a point now where to the onset of major cloud providers and other data warehousing capabilities, the cost of sustaining a lot of that data is no longer what drives a lot of our decision making. It's actually very easy and affordable to store just unlimited capacity, really, from a data standpoint. The challenge more is, how do you manage it in a meaningful way that can be used and to organize around the different scenarios and business problems that you're trying to organize around. That's a lot of what we've been doing for PEO EIS and the Army on what's called the RDAP contract, the Army Data and Analytic Platforms contract. They've acquired lots of data warehousing capabilities and analytic platforms, but the sheer governance of pulling this data in and keeping up with the data standards and the curation processes and et cetera, process is honestly more, in policy, are the challenges they've been confronted with and made huge strides. It's not a technology and storage problem anymore. A common example I use is just where we've had the opportunity to have a meaningful impact is in the sustainment world in the DoD. If the Secretary of Defense asked, what does it cost to sustain a Humvee in the DoD? Well, in the Air Force, they have data standards and maintenance transaction codes and processes at which they manage their data around how they maintain a Humvee. The Marine Corps, you get where I'm going with this, the Navy, the Army, they all do it different. So if you tried to pull all that data in and say, what's the cost per day of availability or cost per year to operate a Humvee, that was nearly an impossible question. And same for every other weapon system that sits in multiple military services, right? So being able to answer basic questions like that are impossible without true data standards and ontologies. And that's actually one of our most important programs that we've done for OSD. And now we're supporting the JAIC and doing the same thing for them, is creating a common ontology for how this maintenance transaction data is managed. And now it's cool. You go out and do all kinds of amazing, meaningful stuff from an AI and ML, but it has to be sitting on a foundation that's meaningful and accurate.
Yeah, let's talk more about the JAIC, the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. You are involved there, and they've come quite a long way since they were established. And I think probably it's safe to say they have a clear understanding now of where AI might fit in the larger military picture. How would you describe their progress, and tell us about some of the work you're doing there to support their goals?
Well, I mean, candidly, when the JAIC first got put into place, right? I think they were very focused on quick wins, which is natural for a new organization to show their value and to generate momentum in what they're trying to accomplish. And that's natural, but where they've moved and where they're posturing themselves now, I believe, is super meaningful and where we need them to be, which is enabling data operations, enabling AI and ML. An example I use commonly with customers on why we have to generate capacity and scale around a common set of tools is, imagine every new company you started working for, or if you're still in the military, every new unit you show up to, they were using a different version of Excel made by a different company. Things would slow down massively, right? In the DoD today, there are literally hundreds of thousands of potential combinations of technologies that you could use to connect to data, to transform that data, to do analytics on that data, and to present that data in some visual, meaningful way. Literally hundreds of thousands of exponential combinations, right? So what the Jake is doing is creating spaces, if you will, for people to come in across the military services and do those activities, right? Go from connect to data, transform and manage that data, do analytics on that data, and push it to production in applications or to users. And that's really where we need them to be, because then now the DoD, you get to a world where you're showing up at different places, and there's a common set of tools that you've been trained on, and there's momentum as soon as you hit the ground day one. And that's something we push a lot of our customers to do. RDAP and on the Army side is doing the same thing, led by the program office over there under Mr. Guffgerd and Rob Wolf. It's a common set of tools for all ORSAs and all analysts to go in and do meaningful stuff with large, complex sets of data.
And these deployments aren't set and forget, are they? Maybe discuss the issue of dealing with the potential for drift in the application of algorithms with the data, bias that can come in, and there's many, many forms of bias. How do they stay away from that, or at least be able to monitor it and adjust as they see these distortions coming in to the AI complex?
Well, I mean, just like humans, these machines, these AI tools, right, can develop biases over time. Back to my example of my 3-year-old, if I wasn't educated enough to know that one particular item they were shoving in their mouth was actually not good, and I was saying it was okay, right, that would become a problem over time, right? And our adversaries are also even doing things that also corrupt data that are feeding different platforms of us and generate biases where, we have an algorithm that's trained to identify dogs, and they can do things with our data that then all of a sudden tells them that it's a cat when it really is a dog, right? And so these are all things that have to be accounted for. So back to my earlier point around, if all these weapon systems are going to have AI and ML, just like humans develop biases over time that we've seen in our history, so will these platforms, right? So you'll hear a lot about that, and DARPA, and there's a lot of cool companies out there that, especially that work for in the quant shops at commercial banks and things like that, that are working on this. We at LMI, through our research institute, have partnered with several companies that are thought leaders in this space, and that's another bill, though, right, that we need to think for and program for as we look to deploy these things in our space. As we think about, in today's world where you go out and you take that piece of equipment and you go train it at the National Training Center or somewhere else, and then once the equipment is good, it's good, right? Well, in the future world, they will always have to be monitors for issues and biases, and that's not something necessarily that we do today.
All right, we're going to take a short break on that note. My guest today is Josh Wilson. He's the Senior Vice President of Service Lines and Technology at LMI. I'm Tom Temin. This discussion is implications of AI and ML-based modernization efforts, sponsored by LMI here on Federal News Network.